thank you all for being with us on this important webinar to discuss the Safer Sooner Time for Change report. My name's Jane Hodges. I'm an Australian based in Geneva, Switzerland, and I'll take us through the next 45 minutes or so with some really knowledgeable and insightful presentations from our three panelists. And then we'll have a bit of an interactive exchange, of course, keeping our eye on any questions you put through the chat. So first of all, let me introduce and the honor we have to have with us for the next moment, three world experts on the issue of eliminating violence against women and girls. I'll start with Marina Pisklakova-Parker, who's the founder and chair of the board of the Center for Prevention of Violence, ANNA, and she'll be calling us from Russia. Then we'll have Helen Rubenstein, an international human rights attorney, specialist in violence against women. And she's the senior counsel to the Global Rights for Women organization and the lead author of the Time for Change book, which made a really strong case for the need of a new binding global instrument to eliminate violence against women. She'll be calling us from Minnesota in the United States. And then we'll have Dr. Francisco Rivera Juriaisti, who's the director of the International Human Rights Clinic at the Santa Lara Law School in the United States. And Fran will be calling us from Puerto Rico. The Safer Sooner report, which I hope you'll all be able to click on the web and if you haven't read it in advance, read it now, makes not only the legal points about the need for a new global binding instrument, but it makes a lot of economic arguments that the cost of violence against women and girls is just not worth leaving the current situation as it is. It talks about, obviously, the individual loss of life. It talks about, of course, the survivors' lifelong trauma that they'll carry with them. And it talks about economic trauma, the strain on healthcare, welfare and judicial systems, the loss of wages for survivors, the loss of productivity for businesses, the reputational loss when big companies, even small companies, lose litigation. And are those descriptions that I've just given you not ringing true with what we're also living with the other pandemic, not the pandemic of violence against women and girls, which this report makes the case for, but the pandemic of COVID-19. So we're going to be blending in as we talk about the Safer Sooner report, just how fortuitous it was. It's out now when this other pandemic is hitting us hard with all those other losses and inequalities coming to the fore. And again, the Black Lives Matters movement, where we've got state-controlled or state-supported violence, whether it's in the United States or across the world. People are fed up. People want change. There is a moment to be seized now, and it's a moment that can be seized to end violence against women and girls through, as the report argues, a new binding global instrument. Let's start with an activist's word from the ground. Marina, you've had a lifetime of commitment and action with grassroots organizations. You know what it's like on the ground. Can we hear from you about the lack of state accountability and what you think a new global instrument would do to fill that gap? I'll give you about 5 minutes each. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jane, and thank you everybody for being here. Our report, the Safer Sooner report, called the violence against women and girls the pandemic before the COVID-19 pandemic, because that's what it is. And the current situation in the world, in Russia and globally, demonstrated the real scale of violence against women and girls. It demonstrated several things. It demonstrated vulnerability, lack of system that works. Frankly, right now, I think we don't have a country where women and girls can be fully safe. And the report shows that, but the reality, the current reality, actually confirmed it. That is why what we see today, COVID-19 was never a cause of violence against women and girls. It's just a catalyst that shows the real picture. Now, what do? I think violence against women and girls, the pandemic of violence against women and girls, is a serious enough issue for humanity that deserves a separate standalone treaty. Why? Because, for example, in Russia, we report to the CEDAW committee, and Russian government reports to the CEDAW committee. For the past 15 years, we've written shadow reports. And there were already 3 times recommendations to the government of the Russian Federation to adopt a law on domestic violence, to stop spreading gender stereotypes, and stop discrimination of women in the labor force and in access to justice. And guess what? Nothing happens. Right now, we are writing a next shadow report because Russia will be actually heard very soon in the CEDAW committee. And I can tell you, we reviewed all the recommendations of the past session. Nothing was implemented related to domestic violence, violence against women in Russia. So I think, and this is my experience, the existing system, the system of recommendations, simply doesn't work. And I think Russia is not unique here. I know that in the rest of the world, about 75% of women and girls are not protected by international treaties. That is why we need to get together, and we need to have a full commitment from the global community on eliminating violence against women and girls. The examples of how the systems don't work. Shelters in many countries were closed because of the pandemic of COVID-19. Law enforcement, even in those countries where there are laws, for example, providing protective orders, restraining orders, they were not able to enforce them because there was no mechanism of eviction that would be fully functioning during the pandemic. And this is just to begin with. And of course, the economic commitment to stopping violence against women and girls globally, again, it's only 12 cents per female in case of violence against women spent for the response and protection. If we want to be serious, and if we want to really, as a global community, show that we are committed to stopping violence against women and girls, we need to get a full treaty that would have all the mechanisms. Read the report and you will understand fully what we propose. But to me, as an activist on the ground, I've dedicated past 7 years to promoting this treaty, writing definitions, talking to the global community. It's 128 countries in this association. We come up globally. And we are grassroots activists that say to the world, it's time. It's time to protect women and girls with a separate treaty. This is the issue that concerns more than half of population on Earth. And we still don't take it seriously. To me, if the global community, and I'm talking here about all of us, if we want to show how serious we are about this issue, it's time not to say, well, we do have something to protect. No, we need a full protection, and we need it now.
Yeah, it's time. Thank you for that message. Some really good points there, and that data. I know that Elizabeth, we're putting up some statistics to make the point that it's pretty cheap when you start to think of the billions of women who are suffering. 12 cents per woman to work on prevention and protection in the fight against violence against women. And I think I'll come back to you on some questions about the committee that oversees the International Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW committee that you mentioned. That will be an interesting follow-up question, I think. Let's turn now to Helen Rubenstein in Minnesota. You've been also an activist, very much in the field of judicial protection, some big cases in your past, but you're living really at an epicenter of this Black Lives Matter movement. The parallels are there with the horrific amount of violence against women coming out, not just from confinement, but linked to this police brutality that we're seeing against marches and demonstrations all over the world. But I'd also like to hear from you about civil society involvement, Helen, and what is the mindset now? Why do you think it's time for a new binding global instrument? 5 minutes.
Thank you, Jane. And I'm especially honored to be on this panel because I am the only member of the panel that wasn't involved in the drafting of the Safer Sooner report. So I do want to take this opportunity from the perspective of another women's rights NGO to the issue of violence against women and the need for a treaty, and why my organization, Global Rights for Women, supports the efforts of Every Woman Treaty to have a treaty created. Global Rights for Women is an NGO based in Minneapolis, as you mentioned, and we work with partners around the world to advance women and girls' human right to be free from violence through legal reform and systems change. And our staff has worked for over 25 years in more than 40 countries around the world to adopt and implement laws and doing training to make sure that those laws are enforced and setting up systems of coordination. In the 1990s, when we started doing this work, many countries didn't have laws on violence against women. But there were women's rights NGOs that were helping survivors to find safety. And in the process of doing that, they became aware and learned what their governments should be doing to protect women and to hold offenders accountable. Passing these laws were hard-fought battles, but it was even harder and continues to be harder to convince the police and justice systems to enforce the laws. And of course, there are never sufficient funds. Working with NGOs and with some governments, we've definitely seen some progress. And above all, awareness has grown of women's right to live free from violence. But we've also seen the deep frustration that still 1 out of 3 women in the world are victims of sexual violence or domestic violence. And that has only been intensified by the isolation that many women are experiencing during COVID-19. The NGOs that we work with tell us that they need more tools. And as Marina said, Russia has many problems in this regard, including having rolled back criminal penalties for their domestic violence, for violations of domestic violence. In Morocco, finally in 2018, they passed a violence against women law after intensive lobbying by women's rights groups for many, many years. But it's a weak law and doesn't even contain a provision for a civil protection order, one of the most fundamental protections for women. So our partners tell us that they need an international treaty, that they need this leverage when their governments fail to provide the protections that they need. This is the reason that Global Rights for Women decided to lend its voice to the call for a treaty on violence against women and girls. And as Jane mentioned, in 2018, we published a paper called Time for a Change, the need for an binding international treaty on violence against women. This paper examined the current mechanisms and instruments on the international and regional levels that address violence against women and found them lacking. They are certainly all valuable, and they are part of a process to gain more protection for women, but alone they're not doing the job. We followed up the Time for a Change paper just this March with a second paper called Time for Action. This paper is more of an advocacy, direct advocacy, and it also contains guidelines for drafting of a treaty. Both of these papers are available on the Global Rights for Women website. I would also like to just take a moment to address the point that Jane raised about being in the epicenter of the current Black Lives Matter protests following the police murder of George Floyd a few weeks ago. I've certainly been doing some soul searching about my role in systemic racism, and the conclusion that I've reached is that this reckoning that many of us are going through reinforces the need for a violence against women treaty. The Say Her Name campaign, started by Kimberly Crenshaw and the African American Policy Forum, brings awareness to the often invisible Black women who have been targets of law enforcement violence. Women like Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland. These women are victims of state-sponsored violence. Like all women victims of intersectional oppression, they deserve a treaty to protect them. We often hear arguments about the feasibility of a violence against women treaty. We hear that the political climate is not right. Well, right now, the political climate is exactly right. The world has been cracked open. There's a desire and an energy to create a more equitable world. We can take concrete action to bring that world into being through a binding international treaty on violence against women. Thank you.
Yeah, Helen, thank you for that strong message that because of this confluence of so many violations, we better get moving right now. There's just no time but the present. The facts are known, the time is now. But let's look at what already we have in the panoply of instruments and frameworks, both international, global, and domestic, because Fran is an expert, of course, in the human rights frameworks themselves. Could you introduce us to what we have, why that's not enough, and from your point of view, why do we need a new global binding instrument? Over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Jane. So as Helen and Marina mentioned, our message is this. The world needs a treaty that specifically addresses violence against women in all of its forms and for every woman and girl everywhere. Now, incredibly, we don't have such a treaty, right? What we have is this patchwork of different international norms that really do not provide the comprehensive coverage that we need. So what we're advocating for in this report is a global treaty that will fill this gap that exists in international law, and we call this the normative gap, right? Now, it's true that some international treaties already address specific aspects of this global problem. For example, violence in armed conflicts or workplace violence, and that some international norms address how some women experience violence, such as women with disabilities, indigenous women, and older women. But there's no single international treaty that comprehensively addresses all aspects of a country's duty to respect, protect, and fulfill every woman's right to live free from violence. As has been mentioned, the main United Nations Treaty on Violence on Women's Rights, CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, is just too broad, right? The scope is too broad. It doesn't specifically address all forms of violence against women. It doesn't even mention the words rape, violence, or assault in its text. And we have UN general recommendations on violence against women that do complement these gaps left by CEDAW, but they lack legally binding authority. So consequently, as Marina highlighted, when UN member states submit reports to the CEDAW committee, for example, issues of violence against women just get diluted, right, among many other human rights issues. But violence against women is such an important and pervasive issue that it demands its own undivided attention. And the numbers tell the story. As Helen mentioned, 1 out of 3 women in the world will be a victim of violence against women. That's billions of women and girls who deserve a new holistic treaty focused solely on violence against women. Now, we can learn from the successful experience of regional treaties that we have on violence against women that cover some parts of the world, right? So these are the Istanbul Convention that covers Europe. We have the Convention of Belém do Pará in the Americas and the Maputo Protocol in Africa. Now, all three have had varying degrees of success in minimizing this normative gap. However, as I've been pointing out, those regional standards, they don't apply globally, right? So we have billions of women in other regions, such as Asia and the Middle East, that lack access to a treaty that specifically addresses violence against women for them. So a global treaty on violence against women will help bridge this, what we call geographic gap, and provide the more universal standards that are applicable to all countries and not just some countries. Now, as you mentioned, I'm most familiar with the regional treaty in the Americas, the Belém do Pará Convention. And this experience actually suggests that an international treaty on violence against women at the UN or global level would indeed have similar positive impact that it's had in the Americas. For example, an international treaty that definitively frames violence against women as a human rights violation is particularly important to avoid the general perception that violence against women is a private matter, that states cannot or maybe need not address. And that's exactly what the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women does. That's the full name of the Belém do Pará Convention. It defines violence against women as a human rights violation. And what this does is it has allowed victims or survivors to bring cases before our regional human rights court, which is called the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And as a result, this court has issued groundbreaking decisions applying this treaty and forcing countries to adequately, for example, investigate violence against women, reform its domestic norms and practices and policies to prevent and eradicate violence against women. And I can talk more about these cases if there's any questions about them. But I do want to emphasize what's been said before, that the time for the treaty is now, right? Governments, grassroots movements throughout the region have built the momentum necessary, right? There's strong political leadership in the Americas. Just look at what's happening in the last few years. Argentina has launched a national action plan to prevent and end violence against women. Uruguay has passed comprehensive law on violence against women. And just a few weeks ago, actually, Uruguay became the first country to ratify the ILO, the International Labor Organization's Convention on Workplace Violence. And last year we had this, viral movement that began in Chile that was drawing from the Me Too movement, that gathered thousands of women into the streets singing this protest song, El Violador Eres Tú, which became a model for protests throughout the world. And just throughout the region, all countries are adopting a series of laws and policies addressing violence against women. So the time is now, and now we're living in a pandemic, right? But we also have this pandemic within the pandemic. And you see countries like Peru and Brazil, who are some of the biggest hotspots for the coronavirus. And therefore we see millions of women who are forced to live with abusive partners, for example, during the pandemic. So there's a renewed call to address violence against women. So in sum, all of this strongly suggests that there is the political will, there is a momentum, there's a grassroots desire and demand to have an international treaty that serves as a catalyst for change. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great overview of the international and the regional, and again, then at the domestic level, all these political acceptance that we need laws, we need frameworks, we need to be training the law enforcers and ensuring that both healthcare providers, welfare situations, and the judiciary and business, private sector, know what this issue is, that there is zero tolerance, and that we have to move now. So let me pick up some of the threads from the three of you, who I thank again for giving us your expertise here. And what Fran was just telling us about the CEDAW gaps and how the committee has tried with general recommendations to fill those gaps. There's one particular relatively recent general recommendation, number 35, on violence against women. But let me link that to what Marina said right at the beginning. Despite a number of years of reporting by the Russian government with the shadow reports from organizations that Marina knows well, these are the non-official reports, but which are also presented to the committee members for them to mull over as they come to question the ratifying government. Let me put to the three of you, why do you think there has been no action by the Russian government? If the Committee on CEDAW was so clear that they need some form of domestic legislation, right, Marina? The specific request was to adopt a law that will cover all aspects, the prevention, the promotion, protection, and remedies. Well, Fran, what do you think? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Marina.
Well, maybe, yeah, I can start since I'm here. I think the problem is that it's recommendations, the word for itself. There is no binding requirement. And actually there are two issues. One issue is that discrimination, the way the Russian government understands discrimination and reports on that much better than on violence against women. Discrimination is in the workplace, healthcare, access to healthcare. So things that are defined as discrimination. But defining violence against women as a form of discrimination, I think it has some obstacle. And to me, I think one reason is our post-Soviet heritage, where there is equality written in the Constitution, that women are equal to men in the Constitution. So formally, the governmental structure, governmental agencies, they just don't see that as discrimination. And I think this is another weakness. So we have to actually framing violence against women as a form of discrimination. And another one is that it doesn't have any enforcement. Basically, it's recommendations.
Okay, I get that. Do you see it that way too, Fran, from your expertise, understanding the CEDAW mechanisms? Are there other governments that just ignore recommendations?
Yes, but I don't want to downplay the importance of these recommendations. In fact, I welcome the efforts of the CEDAW committee to address violence against women and sort of trying to put a round peg into a square hole, trying to address violence against women using an inappropriate framework, which is CEDAW. Now, what we can do is we can use the recommendations from the CEDAW committee, which are fantastic. They really do address violence against women, and we can make them binding. We can incorporate them into a new binding treaty on violence against women that takes into account not just those great recommendations by these experts in the field, but also the experiences of, for example, the 26 years now of the Belém do Pará Convention in the Americas. We have so much experience that we can build from. And that's where this report comes in. We're looking at what works. We're looking at the experiences on the ground, and we're looking at the holes and the gaps that exist, and we're trying to combine them, picking the best from those general recommendations and looking at what, as Marina mentioned, what doesn't work, And we're trying to propose something that actually does work, that takes into account those many years of expertise.
Right. And Helen, what's your view on this? That what we've got, patchy as it is, but we could pick out the best parts and come up with new, innovative approaches to ending violence at women and girls.
I completely agree with what Marina and Francisco have said. We can take the best. We can also learn from more recent experiences on the ground to bring more specificity to a binding international treaty. We continue to learn from our experiences on the ground, and those can also be incorporated into a new binding international treaty.
So it's coming back again to grassroots experience. All three of you have mentioned that. The movements coming from a groundswell of fed upness, if that's a word in English. But do you think a new treaty could have a role for civil society? Because what we've got exactly with the international text, even the ILO Convention number 190 that Fran mentioned, there's a role for workers and employers organizations in that world of work framework to make comments. And we heard about the right of civil society to make shadow reports for CEDAW. What do you think, from all your work with real cases on the ground, what could a new treaty bring for survivors groups?
Absolutely. A new treaty has to be driven by civil society, by victims themselves, and by their advocates who have been working with them, who know what works and what doesn't work. And that takes in the full range of women's experiences with violence from around the world. And I know that Every Woman Treaty has done a great job of incorporating those voices throughout its entire process. And I think that's unique to creating a treaty from the ground up. And having that ground up drive and momentum and support is what can make the treaty successful. That it's the women on the ground who can force their governments to take a new treaty seriously and comply with it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's a good way to end up. Why don't we turn now to Elizabeth and see if there are some questions that we could maybe cluster together and put to our panelists.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm here. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our esteemed panel. It's just, it's so important for us to continue having these conversations. I think when we look at all of the pieces that you guys have said and the current climate in the world, it is just critical to have ongoing discussion. And Helen's point about society needing to participate more fully and how important it is to be inclusive. We in Every Woman Treaty certainly have endeavored to do that. In the remaining few minutes, we've blocked part of our chat box. As women and girls around the world often know, when we speak up for freedom and equity, there are often people who are there to resist such calls, and so we have closed out our chat. But I do have a couple of questions that I would really like to hear from each of you on. And they're based on some questions that were emailed to us because people couldn't get into the chat. And so, Fran, tell us a little bit about this, about the regional framework and how we view, when we talk about the importance of inclusion, there are a lot of different protocols. How do those protocols intersect, and how would a global binding norm help to harmonize all of those voices?
Right, so thank you for that question. So yes, we do have three. In general, we have three human rights regional systems that are separate from the United Nations system. It's important to understand how those connect with each other. So each of these regional systems that exist in Europe as a region, and Africa as a region, and the Americas as a region, they have their own specific treaties and human rights treaties that apply to those countries in those regions. Now, the United Nations has also human rights treaties that apply just globally throughout the world. So we have specific treaties on violence against women in those regions. We don't have a specific treaty at the United Nations that covers the whole world. So that's what we call this a geographic gap. Now, the interplay between those is interesting. In fact, the Inter-American Court just came out with a publication of how, its jurisprudence from that system, relates to and learns from and is enriched by the experiences of the European and the African system. So we see that the only three human rights courts in the whole world, there is no UN human rights court. The three human rights courts in the world are learning from each other and learning what works from each system and applying it in their own jurisprudence, specifically in the issue of violence against women. So that's sort of what we're hoping that the United Nations does with a global treaty, is learn from the experiences of these regional systems, right? So for example, in the Inter-American system, we had a treaty that didn't really allow victims to have direct access to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So, there we learned that the way the treaty was drafted, could be improved to allow women to actually have a direct access to these mechanisms of justice. In the Maputo Protocol in Africa, you have a definition of violence against women, which is broader than those in the other system. It includes economic violence, for example. That's something that the Inter-American system can learn from the African. So the UN treaty hopefully will learn from all those three experiences and improve on them, actually.
Is there another question that, that was
yes,
really
we do. We do have one quick question, and it is from our co-author on the Safer Sooner report, Dr. Eleanor Nwad-Nobi. Do survivors have to exhaust domestic remedies before accessing regional systems? And I think that's important because, as Marina also noted in the chat, the European Court on Human Rights is also effective at addressing these issues.
Would you like me to address it? I'll go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because it addresses the regional systems. Generally, yes, right? So it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to seek justice from an international body, then you do need to exhaust domestic remedies, meaning, the international mechanisms are there only when the domestic remedies fail, right? So, and this is an important message that we need to put out there, which is that the international human rights sphere is there as an emergency system. It's not there as a system of first recourse. It's only when the domestic systems fail that you get to go to the international or regional mechanisms. Unfortunately, domestic systems fail all the time, right? And that's why we need that escape valve to be able to pursue justice internationally. But one last point I want to make, this treaty, hopefully what it will do is actually help strengthen the domestic mechanisms so that women don't have to go to the international or regional mechanisms, so that the states can look at the treaty and see what they need to do domestically to be able to provide and guarantee a life free from violence.
Yeah, I could come in on that one too, because that would be the idea of surely of a binding new global treaty, that there'd be a lot of directions for states' action. So it would be very clear, it'll give clarity, it'll give some really good definitions. So there will be very specific about what's covered, and this kind of vague, no person's land, which is very difficult probably from people like Helen and Marina who've tried to defend people with inadequate laws at the domestic level. That would be fixed. But also this accountability for non-state act of violence would probably be a good thing to add in there, right? I don't want to abuse anyone's time. We're right on 1400 hours over here on the European continent. If I can just have a quick last word, perhaps, or if Marina would like a last word, or Helen, and I'll just close it off by saying, and Elizabeth has her technical moment, the facts are known. Read the report. Read the report, both from the point of view of legal gaps, as it said, normative gaps, geographical gaps, and enforcement gaps. There's no doubt about this. There have been reports and records and expertise and workshops and seminars for over 7 years. There are some great things out there, some really great norms at all different levels, some great domestic laws that are coming up, and there's some wonderful grassroots movement, a moment in time. It's history right now in 2020. The time is now, the facts are known, let's act. So I look forward to following up this conversation, and thank you all enormously for your questions, and to our 3 wonderful panelists, Marina, Fran, and Helen. Thank you.